The single most annoying issue with recording guitar is dealing with latency. I've poorly covered that in a previous video, but this time I want to talk about pitch shifting. Now, I'm a cheap bastard. I love free plugins. Unfortunately, I could not find a decent low latency pitch shifter plugin at my price point of free, which leaves me with two options. One, write my own pitch shifter, or two, use my whammy pedal. The problem with option one, as it turns out, is that while max signal processing can do pitch shifting, it does so with significant latency. I'm no Max MSP wizard, so finding a workaround for that was a bridge too far. I'll probably come back to that idea later, but for now it seems like option 2 was the better plan. The problem with option 2 is that I have zero coordination. Seriously, I cannot even sing and play at the same time. There is no way that I could stay in time with both my guitar and the expression pedal. Luckily, the whammy supports MIDI input, and I have a MIDI output on my audio interface. Working with MIDI doesn't have the same latency issues, as all of the heavy lifting is done with the circuitry in the whammy pedal. Plus, it allows me a great degree of freedom in how I control the pedal. So, let's take a look at how I wrote this patch. Since the whammy pedal is not an instrument in of itself, it's not designed to work like a synthesizer would. You can't just plug in a MIDI keyboard into it, hit a key, and have the whammy shift to that note. Instead, we have to look at the owner's manual and look at the program changes. Each setting of the whammy pedal corresponds to a program number. In order to go from, say, octave up to octave down, you would need to send the following messages to the whammy pedal. Program 2 to set it to octave up, then program 8 to set it to octave down. That's how setting the whammy's configuration works. Now let's take a look at the expression pedal, the bit that you move with your foot. Unlike pitch shift settings, the expression pedal is controlled by a different MIDI protocol called a control change. The only control change that the Whammy 5 supports is CC11, the specific control change set aside for manipulating so-called expression controllers. This protocol is similarly simple, set to only use values between 0 and 127, which is the most data you can conveniently fit in 8 bits. MIDI is an ancient standard, so it was designed for slow, unsophisticated computers, but that's not important right now. Now that we know enough about the technical details of MIDI and the messages the whammy can actually accept, we need to know how to send them to the device. Note, this will require some kind of MIDI output from your computer. Some audio interfaces come with a MIDI output port, or you can use a USB to MIDI cable. They're usually dirt cheap. In Ableton, create a new MIDI channel and change the output to your specific output port. You may have to go into your I/O configuration in Ableton's settings menu if you haven't used it before. By default, the whammy pedal only listens to incoming MIDI messages on channel 10, so make sure you select channel 10 underneath the output port. Once that's all set up, let's take a look at the actual Max4Live patch. There's a lot going on in this patch, but I promise it's actually pretty simple. Starting off, we have a load bang object that sends two numbers to several different places. A load bang is exactly what it sounds like, unless you're Frank Reynolds. It sends a bang when the plugin loads. A bang in Max MSP is essentially a starting pistol. It tells these two numbers to start going to the destination they're routed to. All this load bang is doing is making sure that we zero out the whammy pedal. we want it off by default and set to the octave plus minus harmony setting. It's completely subjective. I just chose that program because it's the one that I use the most. Since off is self-explanatory, let's take a look at where the program change message is going. I wanted this plugin to work identically to the controls of the real Whammy pedal, so the program change is sent to this dial and to this live.tab object. The connections loop back onto itself because I wanted both the live.tab and the dial to always have the same value. This way, the user can turn the dial to select the program or click on the live.tab for ease of use. The two subpatchers before and after the live.tab are only there because the tab's object numbering does not line up with the program numbers, and this was the best workaround that I could muster. Once the dial and the live.tab have been unified, let's look at where they go afterwards. There's a mess of wires and G switches, but there are really only two meaningful changes that happen here. The G switch immediately after the dial switches when the classic button is pressed and becomes chords. This corresponds with the Whammy 5's two algorithms for pitch shifting, the classic, and the newer chords setting. The schematic is designed in such a way that all you need to do to go from one to the other is add 42 to the program number. Easy peasy. The other G switch is merely an on-off switch, where we add an offset of either 22 or 1 depending on which algorithm we're using. Again, the only difference between on and off is a program number. Believe it or not, that was the most complex part of the patch. The next step simply sends the appropriate program change message combined with 10 to ensure that it's transmitted on the right channel via the program out object. The A parameter on program out simply means that it will use MIDI port A, which is already the default. It's been a while since I wrote this part. I don't remember if it's really necessary, but it doesn't hurt anything. Let's take a peek at the expression pedal. This one is easy. Like, really, really easy. We have this live.slider object. We have message boxes with 11 and 10, and we have a CTL out. Control out is what sends the control change message. 11 represents the expression controller control change, and 10 is again the MIDI channel. The live.slider can be automated directly from Ableton, so you can draw perfectly timed curves or whatever else you might want. That's it. That's all there is to it. I wanted to do some freaky stuff with this Whammy pedal, so I wrote in a bonus feature that's not something that you could easily do by hand. I mean, by foot, I guess. On the side here, we have a MIDI in object plugged into a MIDI out for pass-through and a MIDI parse object. The MIDI parse object takes the raw MIDI data, as in notes in the piano roll or MIDI clip, and breaks it down into something we can actually work with. In this case, we only care about the pitch and the velocity. MIDI notes, unlike program and control changes, are sent by defining a pitch and a velocity. The pitch can be anything from 0 to 127, which is a lot more than a standard 88-key piano. And the velocity is also 0 to 127, except 0 is a special number. A MIDI note with velocity of 0 tells the receiver, turn this note off. So if you sent a C3, also known as middle C, or in MIDI notation, 60, with the velocity of 127, it would play that note as loud as possible until another MIDI note at 60 with a velocity of 0 is sent. Luckily, Ableton handles the note on, note off stuff, so we don't really need to worry about that too much. Once the MIDI note has been passed through the unpack object, we can apply an offset to pitch or velocity. We only care about the pitch, since the Whammy does not have any volume controls. We still need the velocity because we need to be able to turn it off as necessary, but we don't care about modifying it. This offset allows us to define a root note, which I have set the default to C3, which we can pitch shift around. This makes it really easy to play a single note on the guitar and then program in an arpeggio in Ableton, which makes for a very interesting and glitchy sound. After applying the offset, we pack the pitch and velocity together again and route it through some fancy logic and scaling. Essentially, each one of these 4 sets of if statements has their own section of the keyboard they cover. If the note is between C1 and B1, the patch automatically selects the 2-octave down program on the Whammy pedal and scales it between the appropriate MIDI values, so the expression pedal will be exactly on that specified note. The other 3 logic statements do the same, but with C2 through B2, C3 to B3, and C4 through C5. All that's left to do after that is send it to the same live.slider object we used earlier to automate the expression pedal. So now that we've taken a look at the Max patch, let's take a look at how to actually use this in practice. What I have here is 2 copies of the same dry guitar sound. I have this recorded as a dry signal, but there's no reason why you couldn't just record the sound after your Whammy pedal and be fine with that. I just have the recording going out from my computer to my pedal board, through the Whammy, and then back in. I prefer it this way, as I can adjust the precise timing of the guitar before it goes into the Whammy pedal, as well as make changes to the Whammy settings without having to re-record the original dry guitar part. Now let's mess with the pedal. Pretty straightforward. It's not super fun to automate though, as I will show you. Right-click, show automation, and then we get this. If we automate the pedal slider directly, we get this unusable, massive range. So let's avoid that by mapping the slider to a macro instead. What we're going to do is we're going to hit Control-G if you're on a Mac, that's Command-G. You're going to right-click on the pedal, and you're going to hit Map to Macro 1. Now, the difference is, while we have this really zoomed out automation thing when we try to automate the device directly, when we try to automate a macro, on the other hand, you get a nice little range like this. Now, I am just going to draw in a simple sawtooth-like pattern, and let's see how that sounds. Not the most interesting pattern, but that's all there is to it. Now that I've shown you how to automate the pedal, let's take a look at how to use the MIDI notes to control the Whammy. Unfortunately, we are going to have to remove the macro mapping we just set up, as the macro setting overrides the routing within the patch. Next, we're going to set the root note to match the recording. I will set it to G3. This is most helpful for keeping track of what you're playing. If the original note was a G, and the MIDI note we send to the Whammy is a B, then you'll get a B in return. But if we leave the root note at C, you would get an F sharp instead. Simply put, everything is relative to the root note. So with the root note set to G3, that means that G3 is off. There will be no MIDI on this note. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a bunch of these, And I'm just going to move them down an octave, and we'll see how that sounds. Neat. Now let's look at how to do an arpeggio. I'm going to use a G major 7 arpeggio for this example. Now let's see how this sounds. Sounds really goofy. Let's do something else. You can go up to 2 octaves up or 2 octaves down. And that's all there is to it. Hopefully you'll have better luck at creating interesting whammy patterns than I did. Alright, the final step that I'm going to show you is how to paste this patch into your projects. So let's click on the MIDI channel that we created previously. I'm going to click on Max4Live in the left pane here. I'm going to click on Max MIDI effect. I'm just going to drag that down, and then I'm going to hit the edit button. And then I'm just going to hit Control A and delete everything that's in here. I'm going to copy the patch from this TXT. We're going to hit Edit, Paste, and as you can see, we have the patch exactly as I had it. Then we just hit Save, name it something conspicuous, and we're almost done. If we close out of this now, you'll get this horrible mess. Let's go back to the edit mode. Make sure you don't have anything selected. Hit the inspector button. Click on the grid to void any selection. If your inspector window looks like this, just click on the P button to bring up the patcher inspector. Make sure that you select Open in Presentation and hit Save. Now when you click on presentation mode, what you see there will match what you see in Ableton. I'll put this Max patch up somewhere for anybody interested in it. Do keep in mind you will need Ableton Live Suite for this to work, as that's the only version that comes with Max4Live. You also will need a whammy pedal with a MIDI port and an appropriate cable. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. If not, hopefully you'll get some use out of this patch. I really don't know what to post on my channel, so if this video does well, I might make more content like this. Like and subscribe.